Right. Hey, everyone. And hello, Facebook as well, if you're joining us. My name is Josh Lamm with Raleigh Pride, and we're here for the HERstory, THEMstory discussion, which is related to using correct pronouns and identities when it comes to historical figures. So this is very much meant to be a discussion. So for those who are joining on Zoom, feel free to use the chat if you prefer to either not go by voice, and I'm happy to read off and have others respond, or if you don't feel comfortable participating, feel free absolutely to say so there as well. So to start this off, also if everyone on the Zoom call would like, you're able to rename yourself and put your preferred pronouns in your name as well. That will absolutely help everyone not misidentify you in person as well on the call. So we should probably just jump right in, right? So the first thing that I think is important to talk about when we think about writing about historical figures in a modern way is today's language versus yesterday's language. And in my research on this, that mostly directly impacts people of trans and gender nonconforming identities. And there is a long history of pronoun usage and defaults that turns out to be kind of directly related to linguistics and incapabilities that is inherent to language that, those who are driving the conversation tend to be unable to detach themselves from. I think we mostly see that happen in the form of the pronoun he or the default to the masculine. And that and the patriarchy kind of thing it's a conversation unto itself. But I want to open that question up to those on the call. So what do you consider your identity to be? And in your life, is that something that has changed? If anyone wants to respond. But like I said, absolutely no pressure. So. I will say that for myself, I identify as a cisgender, gay, white man, right? I think that there was a time in my life where I considered myself to be straight. And so in that way, my identity has changed. But I think to take a historical look, gay as it relates to cisgender men is not an identity that has changed or that suffers from any kind of renaming, right? And that is especially, I don't know, it's just kind of unique in that way for the word gay, whereas for an identity like trans is not the case. I think that there are definitely examples currently that we see in mainstream on television and in media. The first one that comes to mind is the TV show Pose, where they refer to themselves as transsexuals, right? So in context, in the context of writing for TV in period, that seems to be an acceptable use of that word, where in today, sitting here in 2020, that's not how we identify people of trans experience, right? So when it comes to the written word or visual mediums, as in, a person writing a post or making a video, that could really come under fire for being incorrect. and just like genuinely not palatable to people of that experience or others listening who are aware of kind of the landscape there. And I think that does directly play into how certain legal documents are written, how certain obituaries are written. I know that it's like very common for passed away to be dead named in obituaries or so in police reports and that kind of thing. So it definitely draws attention to legal and moral, like the kind of play between those two, the obligations that we have when we talk about not just historical figures, but people who are no longer with us, generally speaking, and what their identity was at the end of their life, and how we talk about certain periods of their life as well. Does anyone want to comment on that? Does anyone have any ideas about it or any experience directly relating to it?
Yeah, hold on just a second. Yeah, so I know that there's a couple things. For me, especially whenever I'm watching certain things on TV, for example, Pose, and whenever I hear certain words that are outdated and have been used, as derogatory or what have you, sometimes I kind of have that like cringe reaction of like, oh, that makes me uncomfortable. But I also recognize how far language has come and how far language is just ever evolving, and it's a constant, changing thing. And I know that it's really hard for people to realize that and to adapt to that. But I know for me, language, especially pronouns, that's been like a journey in my life of trying to figure out what fits and what makes sense. I, for a long time, identified as, a cisgendered female because I didn't really have the language to really figure myself out and to, really be able to put it into words and like make it make sense in my mind. But once I started realizing, thinking more deeply about gender and how like gender evolves and like how with that like pronouns and other language evolves, I think that I started thinking of myself as more of like gender fluid and like what does that mean and is that really what makes sense for me. And then with the pronouns, I definitely was like, okay, well, I really want to try and use the singular they them pronoun, but I felt like I was asking too much of people, so I still allowed people to use she her pronouns for me. But I like that. Just once I started realizing who I was like, that's too uncomfortable to me. And I actually think, and Natalie joined us on the call. Sorry to call you out, Natalie, but I'm going to. I think Natalie was probably one of the first people that said to me, like, who cares? Like, you should use they, them pronouns. It was at like a conference that we were at. We were both there for separate organizations. And like, I remember you saying that to me and I was like, you know what? Yeah. Like, that's like, it still took me a while to like actually just move to just using they, them pronouns. And even more recently, I started trying to see how I felt about he, him pronouns as I've like been transitioning. But I just feel more comfortable. I feel more myself whenever I'm thinking about myself using singular they, them pronouns. But when people use other pronouns for me, I'm just like, that's not right. but you know, as I figured that out, like as I figured out my identity, I figured out the whole pronouns, and like it's changed and evolved, and yeah, that's, I mean, that's kind of like my personal experience.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I think like what you're saying definitely impacts the larger conversation about how we research that, right? Because I mean, you know, clearly in a person's life, there is, you know, potentially a defining moment where you say, hey, you know what, this is how I would like to be referred to. And moving forward, I would appreciate it if we could all get behind my decision. So when reading about historical figures, you know, who necessarily always knows when that happens? I mean, not everyone who has gone through that exactly has the platform to be identified that way in the first place, right? So in as much, I think it's important to recognize where you start when you say, hey, I want to write about this person. This is what I know their identity to be, but maybe I need to take a second look so that I don't risk using incorrect pronouns or misidentifying them entirely. So I think heading to a conversation about reputable sources and primary versus secondary sources is where you have to go first, right? Who do you trust? What do you look for? I think that there's definitely a big difference in someone who has expertise in an area and someone who has experience in an area when it comes to the question of identity, right? I mean, to kind of demystify that a little bit, what I mean is I don't want to necessarily read an op-ed from a straight person on any kind of queer experience. I'd rather read a queer person's experience on a queer experience, right? So that's really what I mean about expertise versus experience. But I want to open this up again and just ask, you know, when you are going and doing any kind of research, you know, what is it that you look for, or who is a trusted and favorite source of yours? Anyone? So I also have ideas.
Hey y'all.
Hey.
So I don't think I have a trusted source per se. Especially with a lot of LGBTQ figures over the years. A lot of stuff hasn't come to light until the past like 10, 15 years.
Yes.
So I think it's a matter of just looking for what information is there and then just reading it all, kind of. Like giving everybody a chance to talk about who the person is and kind of get different perspectives on it. I would prefer like an autobiography if you can find them, or accounts from folks who know the person, or someone who does know a lot about LGBTQ history. And so they can speak on it in terms of, they'll even keep in mind what terms were appropriate for the times, you know. That's usually where I start. And I know one of the first things I read about overall, like the gay community when I was in college, was Gay New York. I cannot remember who the individual is who wrote it, but it was a fascinating read about specifically, it focused on the gay cis male community, but how broad that looked, because the gay community in New York happened to be in the same areas where there were lower income, working class, blue collar type folks, and how everybody kind of just mingled. And this idea that like the American male did not come about until after World War II. And this person is very well known. I'm just gonna Google it right now. We're on a computer. This person is very well known for their histories on. That's hilarious. I Googled Gay New York and like the Stonewall Inn comes up. Here we go. On the histories of just the gay culture. So George Chauncey, that's his name.
George Chauncey.
Yeah, so Gay New York, Gender, Urban Culture, and the Making of the Gay Male World, 1890 to 1940. I think a lot of people actually might use this reference. But yeah, I look to folks who have experience writing about this type of work, who might have known the people or known folks who knew the folks. You know, it's funny, I don't always look for LGBTQ folks for autobiographies and biographies and stuff, or excuse me, for biographies and for research. But that also adds, like, you know, another layer of understanding too.
Right, absolutely. And that's what I've been thinking as well, that there are always, you know, those primary resources, the diaries, the letters, the poems, the novels. And then there are the secondary resources like obituaries, biographies, articles, historical nonfiction. And, you know, when it comes to like articles and stuff specifically, because I think that definitely resonates very well with how a lot of us take in information, whether it comes through, you know, some social media platforms feed or whatnot. You know, you always have the ability to look up who wrote what you are reading. And there are resources like Muckrack. It's Muckrack, Muckrack. They kind of conglomerate where certain authors have been published, right? So you can take a quick scan of like where their work has been and kind of see, you know, whether there is some, you know, very clear bias that you need to be aware of, or there's some kind of like leaning that maybe you're not gleaning from the writing itself, but might have kind of like an overarching theme like throughout their work. And specifically when using sources like articles, it's, you know, when you're reading those and you go about referencing them, of an interesting thing that I was reading about articles as secondary sources is that usually when you're referencing them or when you're using them to kind of further the conversation, you're using it to test its arguments against new evidence. And so sure, there's like the academic implications of that for like dissertations and thesis and whatnot, but I think, you know, more often than not, when you're talking about writing a post or making a YouTube video or something, that new evidence is really your own experience, right? And your own comfortability with the terms, essentially, and pronoun usage as well in this context. And I think that an interesting example of what I mean by that is the word queer itself. I think that we all know that it has a complicated history as a slur and then having been reclaimed, as it were, right? Also, hi, Britt. Welcome. And I was reading, or I found a good article. It's an NPR article, and the title of it is "A Former Slur is Reclaimed and Listeners Have Mixed Feelings." And that's something that I definitely understand in kind of like a generational gap way. But I wonder, for those of us who are here, how do you feel about that word? Would you be comfortable, you know, as someone looking forward, identifying you that way, you know, kind of like deferring to it when unsure of like a specific identity, or just using it in general? I mean, I'll start and say I feel comfortable being identified that way. You know, like I say, I'm a cis gay white man, but I don't feel like someone referring to me as a queer person is something I don't want them to do. But again, not everyone feels that way. And in that article, to be clear, that article was written as a direct response to the viewership and the listenership saying, hey, you know, you should probably really talk about why you're starting to use this, because we don't really like it and we want to know what your thinking is behind it. And in that article itself, those who were opposed were mostly gay men. So I think that that does show a little something about who is driving that conversation, or at least who was, you know, in this piece, right? So that's definitely part of like the critical take-in. You know, I feel like we can trust the NPR article. I also feel like it's important to note, you know, who is raising the issue as well, you know, and who is being responded to in that way. And then in NPR's Code Switch series, they actually decided not to run a piece about the word queer and its history because they didn't feel that it was that it was relevant any longer to the audience that they were, you know, currently getting. But I want to open up for discussion, you know, who is it that makes that decision? Like, what are the criteria like for being satisfied with something like reclaiming a term or using it retroactively to describe folks in history? What do you think?
Well, I've had a lot of conversations lately about the term queer and just the various implications of different terms that folks use to describe their identities and their lived experiences. And it seems like I just want to name like that there seems to be multiple conflicts or concerns around that word. And one is this retroactive use of the word to refer to folks who, like, if they lived now, might be considered to be of queer experience, but back then, like, that was a word that was extremely harmful and derogatory. And so to like take a choice away from someone post-mortem who like can't decide if that would be a term that they would want to be used for themselves is absolutely a form of harm and disempowerment of someone's memory. And then there are the conflicts within people that are alive today with the term, one of which is folks who like maybe like elders in the LGBTQ community who lived during a time in which that word was derogatory and don't want to reclaim it or have that word used to describe them, but who then decide also that like nobody should you know, use that word to describe their experience because when they, you know, earlier in their lives, you know, it was derogatory, and which gets into this conflict of like, who makes the decision about who should use what terms to describe themselves. And if the concept of the word queer is understood now to mean like a culture and a community that inherently challenges heteronormativity and cis patriarchy and like anything straight or cis, and just like the kind of like opposite of that, and like the challenging of boundaries and norms, then for someone else to be saying, you know, this is not a term you should use to describe yourself as, or, you know, we need to all, even though we are not straight or cis, we still need to fit neatly into boxes, which in my opinion inherently reinforces like grouping ourselves, because humans panic when we can't group ourselves, but then reinforcing that you need to fit in a box to be okay, even within a community that's supposed to be challenging boxes and norms. There's like a conflict with that, with people that, you know, understand the word queer to be something derogatory or write off the word queer as something that's too fluid and we need to fit in boxes. And so I just think there's multiple conflicts going on that I've observed. And in my personal experience have struggled with the word queer, like using the word queer to describe myself, even though I'm not upset when other people, you know, use that word to describe me, because I experienced a community in the lesbian community. I mean, that was a community that I was like closely affiliated with, I guess is the word, of this idea that like, because queer is a word that is inherently fluid and inherently means like, you know, an umbrella of experiences or an umbrella of, genders of partners or that it was too fluid, and it meant that you were somehow like less valid in your membership in the queer community or in the LGBTQ community than like someone who fit neatly in a box. So it's been interesting to see like different pockets of the LGBTQ community respond to the word differently, and wonder how much of that response is due to historical trauma, like in elders who were alive at a time when it was very derogatory, versus folks now that are seeking validation from a society that accepts people more when they perform scripts and when they perform, fitting into a lane or something. Anyway, enough feelings over here.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think also there's an element of using the word queer that tends to act as like an umbrella, that it, may also be used as an easy way to just identify, the entire LGBTQ plus community, to just like as a signifier, when you see that word, what someone's trying to communicate to you is that, that's what that's where I'm going with this. And, you do have to wonder, like, is that right? You have to wonder, is that what everyone wants to be, what am I trying to say? What everyone wants to be used, as like how someone transitioned into having a conversation about the LGBTQ plus community. And so there's a really, it's from, I guess it's Howard University. I can definitely find out if anyone's really interested. But there is it's a PDF that is called Language of Difference, Writing About Gender and Sexuality. And they have a pretty small but kind of comprehensive bulleted list that is about how to frame what you're trying to say when it comes to identities and pronoun usage. And one of them says specifically, avoid terms that evaluate or that might imply inferiority or superiority. And I know that part of that conversation and further down in that PDF talks about middle class, lower class, higher class. It definitely has like socioeconomic implications, like why maybe it's better not to use those terms. And then they transition into talking about MTF and FTM, and maybe why you should check yourself when you go to use that as like a signifier of some kind. So does anyone here want to talk about that, like maybe why that is an important thing to not do or to definitely do, or anywhere in between?
I know for me that there's a couple things, but I think one of the things that I have recognized that I also have heard from other people of not using MTF or FTM especially is that it's somehow says that they're like you're basically going from one gender to another gender. Like there's still that very much there's only two gender language. And so some people think it's like it's not as simple as that, right? I mean, a lot of people think it's not as simple as that, myself included. Like it's not as simple as like going from, like when you're transitioning, just because you may say you're transitioning doesn't mean it's the same experience as someone else. And so, and it also has to do with like language that makes you feel comfortable. So for me, like I would never consider myself to be FTM, right? I would never necessarily describe my experience that way, because, you know, not and taking away like the terms that I use and how I identify and all that, like transition wise, that's just not what's happening. But from when people look at me from the outside, that's probably what they think is happening, that I am transitioning, you know, from female to male. But that's not, you know, it's more complicated. There's a lot more going on. There's a lot more fluidity in a lot of ways. And then obviously people don't necessarily take the time to learn that, you know, learn that I'm non-binary, you know, even though I like to present more masculine, like I still have very, you know, there's a lot going on. So I kind of wanted to say something about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it. And I think that that is kind of the most valuable thing that one can do when you're trying to do any kind of research, right, is to defer to an experience, as opposed to some kind of like, I don't know, clinical dissertation on, you know, something related to that. Because again, it's like, it goes back to the big three questions that when getting my creative writing degree, was always taught. You know, you definitely want to know the answer to three questions. Number one, who is writing the story? Number two, who is the story about? And I think by extension, who is the story for? And then number three, who is missing from the story? I think that you can glean a lot about, you know, any singular piece of anything, whether it's written or visual or simply verbal, like a podcast or something, by giving a listen through at least once and just trying to answer those three questions. It's definitely an illuminating thing to do, for the reasons that Corey is saying, like, hey, no one took the time, you know, to figure out what exactly I feel about my own experience, as opposed to branding it that way. Because again, like, it's an easy thing to do. There are umbrella-like terms that exist that you can use inappropriately really, really easily. And one of the other points in this is to assume a wide audience. And what they say is, do your terms imply a judgment? Or I guess by extension, do your terms assume ideas to be true that necessarily are not, or may have changed? And, you know, if you find that that might be the truth, then you should probably rephrase them. So definitely assuming a wide audience, avoiding terms that evaluate or imply inferiority or superiority, and then also using an appropriate degree of specificity at the same time. The example that they use is Dominicans rather than Hispanics. You know, I think that you can come up with a lot of those, kind of like getting more granular on that scale. And then focusing on people rather than a method of categorization. So again, the example here is people with mental illness rather than the mentally ill. There's like definitely a big difference when you're just like scanning across and reading that. But I think that we should probably spend the last amount of time that we have, which is about 15 minutes, on accountability. So what happens, you know, when you misidentify someone, or you use the wrong pronouns in a written or a visual medium? I think that there are definitely a lot of examples that people have put out there in the form of these secondary sources and primary sources that talk about what that looks like. I know that the Kimberly Crenshaw podcast, Intersectionality Matters, has a great episode about apologies. And one of the main standouts for it, from that, for me, was usually, or like usually folks expect like an apology to come like quick, fast, and in a hurry and kind of like first, right? But the person that she's interviewing argues that like, well, that's, good and well, and is definitely something that everyone wants to hear, but there is kind of a performative aspect to it when there's, no time being taken to really evaluate the situation. And so they argue that like, and something like an apology really is the last thing that happens, or that maybe should happen in their point of view, right? So I think should be pointed out that in written medium, that comes in the form of edits, and you see it all the time in news stories, or even like I was looking up Marsha P. Johnson's obituary that she was given not until 2018 by the New York Times, and in it there are updates, in the bottom of it. They had gotten some of the year information wrong in their chronology. So like, even those kind of details when you're looking back at historical figures matter a lot. And they have major implications on like honoring someone's memory or retelling the story of their life. So that being said, I think that the NPR article I've been referencing is a great example itself of accountability. Folks are saying, hey, I don't like that you're doing this. I need to know why you're doing this. And they said, you know what, cool. We're just gonna open up what happens in the newsroom, and we're gonna throw out this entire article about, who is making this decision? Why did we decide to do this? Where are we looking, and who are we listening to? So does anyone have thoughts on accountability in this context, like how that happens or what you may expect?
I think it's like there's several layers to it. So if you're engaging in a conversation with somebody, or you're around people, or if it's like a immediate thing that might, post on Instagram or Facebook or something like that, but especially in conversations, if you misgender somebody, apologize, correct yourself, and keep it moving. But the keeping it moving means that after the conversation, you need to sit down with yourself and figure out, why did you misgender this person? And what is causing you to or it might not be a constant thing, but what is it when you look at this person, you're not seeing them for who they are? What is it about the situation where you're using the wrong pronouns? So I think apologizing, there's certain circumstances where if you mess up, you need to apologize in the moment. There's still work that needs to be done. That doesn't mean an apology can't be said. And it doesn't mean that an apology is empty. I know we've built a society around everybody is saying sorry. And so I've tried to work on not saying sorry unless I mean it, or if I know why I'm going to say it, and then also do the work as to why it is. So like because language is ever evolving and changing. So for instance, women and woman with an X and a Y is something that folks are no longer doing. It's come to light that those terms were created by folks in the 70s who weren't really supportive of trans women. So we don't want to use those terms anymore. But plain people do. And so it's having a conversation. So say, for instance, if somebody makes a comment in your comments and says, hey, people aren't using it anymore. What I've noticed is that on social media, people will leave up what they did instead of deleting it as a way to acknowledge that they have caused, a lot of people use the term harm, but a mistake was made. And then an edit is made underneath and said, hey, I recognize that these terms are no longer used. I'm going to leave this comment up for my own accountability. I don't want to delete it from the world. I did this thing, I'm acknowledging it, and these are the corrections. And as I say that, it's very similar to what newspapers would do. Sometimes they'll just put the edit underneath, or they'll say, this original article was printed on this date and have the incorrect information. This is now the new one. I think that people just need to be thoughtful when it comes to why they're apologizing, or why if somebody's asking for accountability, it really does take some thoughtfulness as to why it's happening, and a discourse as well. But to also understand that some things, if you're harming another person, it's not their burden to take, and that you need to do the work. So especially when it comes to pronouns and stuff, I've had people who will misgender friends of mine, and it doesn't make sense to me. Like, on the face value of all the pronouns you could call this person, why are you picking that one? And then I realized, because it's deeper than just like you look at this person and you don't see them for who they are, but it's not that person's responsibility to teach them. Sometimes it's friends calling them in. Sometimes it's just people around saying, hey, we need to sit down and talk because you're causing harm to this person. Why do you keep doing this? But yeah, those are my thoughts. Anybody else want to talk?
Yeah. Corey and I are, in this large office together. That was really funny. So I, like everything Natalie said really resonated with me. And I also have learned over the years that an important component of accountability for me in misgendering in any mistake. Like the other week, I was learning about someone had used the term Eskimo sister, and how, because that was used for people that have slept with the same person, and I had no idea that that was not a term. And once and then someone slid up in my DMs and was like, oh yeah, people aren't using that anymore, it's insulting to Indigenous Canadian folks. And I was like, oh yeah, thank you, I'm not going to use that anymore, and I'm going to share that I learned this thing. So but with that being said, it was just the gratitude component, I think, is something that folks miss out on in accountability, because in a world where we're starting to recognize the deep emotional labor of marginalized people, and see folks setting boundaries around the emotional labor they exert, or try to encourage a culture in which that happens, someone who's taken the time to correct you, or name harm that you caused, is exerting emotional labor to do so. And obviously that's a little bit different when it's a person that does not hold the marginalized identity that maybe is being harmed in that situation. If a cis person is correcting another cis person on their misgendering of someone of trans experience. But there's a choice that's being made by a person who is placing accountability with you to do so. And so something that's been helpful to me is also naming gratitude that someone chose to place that accountability. And then I had a thought and I just, oh my God, looked out the window and lost it. But yeah, just because there is labor and accountability too, and a lot of it is unpaid. And that, I think, oh, that's what it was, giving credit where credit is due, with expressing gratitude and expressing that publicly as well, it's also crediting the person that exerted that labor to place accountability. And often those accountability conversations just aren't credited for the labor that marginalized people put into reducing harm against their communities, and maybe can redirect a conversation to show how folks that don't belong to marginalized communities and are seeing harm through language, specifically in this example, done to marginalized communities, can be stepping up, or moving up, sorry, not stepping up, to be doing more of that work, so that that doesn't fall on the people that have been harmed for historically and presently.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, there's definitely a lot of responsibility on an individual who does make a mistake to not just apologize, but to recognize, the person who brings it to their attention in the first place. And I think, Corey, you had something to say?
Yeah, I know that we just kind of started talking about accountability, so I definitely want to plug that we are going to be having an community accountability workshop happening tomorrow at 5:30 on Zoom. It's only going to be on Zoom, so anybody watching this through Facebook Live or YouTube, please go to outraleighrpride.org to sign up for that workshop, and we'll be letting people in all the way up until when the event is. So it's tomorrow at 5:30. But anyways, you can continue.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. And we just have about 3 minutes left, so I want to round this out just by saying it's really important to understand that pronoun usage in general it's a struggle that faces the LGBTQ plus community from within as well as without, right? I've heard a lot recently in just listening and reading about responses from the LGBTQ plus community that in a way that is very intersectional, can definitely hurt people within our own community to say, hey, this is not our problem to address, right? As like a collective our. Which like in as much excludes those very people who you are claiming to kind of like be with, right? So I want to finish by saying, that this conversation is one that needs to be had between all communities within the community. Just being an LGBTQ plus community member does absolutely not exclude anyone from exhibiting those behaviors or making those mistakes. I think what matters to us all is the accountability and the work that happens afterwards if you do happen to make that mistake. And it can all start in this context with how you do your research, where you're looking, who you're trusting, and how you're thinking about it, especially when it comes to who you are as an individual writing about someone else. There's a lot of interplay there that hopefully we've shed some light on today that may not be apparent from the outset. So I appreciate everyone for joining today. Thanks for discussing and offering your perspectives. Thank you so much. And hopefully in that spirit of accountability, we'll see a lot of folks tomorrow afternoon. And then be sure to check the calendar for everything else going on tonight. There's a lot to be experienced. So go Pride.